Dear learners, welcome back to WSE True Stories, where English learning becomes an unforgettable adventure. Today, we step into a time of darkness, war, and doubt, and meet a man whose voice became a beacon of hope. This is not just a story about a politician or a wartime leader. This is the story of a man who stared into the face of defeat and thundered back with just two words: never surrender. He was stubborn, bold, and often underestimated. He made mistakes, lost elections, and was mocked by his peers. But when the world trembled in fear, when bombs fell from the sky and dictators rose to power, he rose with them, not to follow, but to fight. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain during its darkest hour, was more than a man of war. He was a man of words, a man of iron will, and a man of immense faith in the human spirit. In this story, you won't just practice English listening and vocabulary. You'll feel courage. You'll hear resilience. And you'll understand how one man's voice kept an entire nation standing. So get ready. Because this is a story of storms, fire, and unbreakable spirit. Let's begin the journey of Winston Churchill, the lion who roared when the world stood silent. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born on November 30, 1874, in Blenheim Palace, a grand estate in Oxfordshire, England. From birth, he belonged to the elite. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a prominent conservative politician. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was an American heiress, stylish, intelligent, and socially influential. But despite his noble blood and wealth, young Winston's early life wasn't bathed in affection. His father, though brilliant and ambitious, was distant and harsh. Winston admired him deeply, but rarely received his approval. His letters were formal, cold, and filled with judgment. His mother, dazzling and social, spent more time in high society than in the nursery. Much of Winston's early childhood was shaped not by hugs and bedtime stories, but by nannies and boarding school walls. At Harrow School, he struggled with grades and discipline. He had a speech impediment, a lisp, and often felt like an outsider. Other boys mocked him. Teachers doubted him. But even then, Winston showed hints of his future self, defiant, imaginative, and unafraid to stand alone. He found a passion for the English language, especially history, literature, and rhetoric. He devoured tales of ancient heroes and great battles. He wasn't the top of his class, but his mind was fertile ground for greatness. "I was not a bright student," he once said, "but I always had a thirst to prove them wrong." While the British Empire reigned over a quarter of the globe, a quiet storm brewed inside the boy. He was growing up in a world of grandeur, yet feeling unseen in his own home. He belonged to the ruling class, yet tasted the bitterness of personal rejection. These contrasts forged something unique, a young man who would one day understand both the weight of power and the pain of being underestimated. The late 1800s were a time of global change. Technology was advancing, empires were expanding, and tensions across Europe were rising. The British Empire was proud, but not invincible. The world that Winston would grow into would soon ask, who would stand and lead when the fire came? As he prepared to join the military, no one expected greatness from him. In fact, he failed the entrance exam for Sandhurst, the Royal Military College, twice. But he didn't quit. On the third try, he passed. And just like that, the underestimated boy was on his way to become a soldier, a writer, and eventually, a voice that would echo through history. But even before the wars, Winston's fight had already begun, against doubt, against rejection, and against a world that didn't believe in him. And soon, his first test would come, not on British soil, but far from home. Winston Churchill's first real taste of life beyond the aristocratic bubble came through war. As a young officer, he served in the 4th Hussars Cavalry Regiment. But he wasn't content with simply riding horses and following orders. He wanted glory. He wanted to be remembered. And so, while still in uniform, he picked up his pen. Churchill became a war correspondent, writing bold, vivid reports from the front lines. He chased danger, not to escape it, but to understand it. His early assignments took him to Cuba, India, and the Sudan, where he joined the battlefields and wrote his reflections on war, empire, and honor. These articles made him famous, even before he entered politics. But the moment that would test his courage and ignite a fire in his soul came in 1899, during the Second Boer War in South Africa. Winston, still in his 20s, boarded an armored train to report on the British military's actions. But the train was ambushed. Under heavy fire, and surrounded by Boer fighters, Churchill helped clear the tracks and led men to safety, even though he was technically just a journalist. Still, he was captured. Now a prisoner of war, locked in a Pretoria camp, Churchill faced something far worse than gunfire: irrelevance. For a man who burned with ambition, sitting behind bars felt unbearable. But Winston wasn't one to sit still. In a daring escape, he climbed a latrine wall under the cover of darkness, sneaked past guards, and leapt onto a moving train. With nothing but chocolate, a crumbled biscuit, and a few coins, he fled across 300 miles of enemy territory before reaching safety. The British press exploded. Churchill returned home as a hero, not just for surviving, but for refusing to be held down. And this time, it wasn't because of his name, it was because of his courage. It was this experience, being captured, humiliated, but then rising, that shaped Churchill's understanding of defeat and defiance. He began to see life as a series of trials, meant to be met head-on, with resolve and wit. But behind the headlines, a deeper struggle brewed. Despite his fame, many in the political elite saw him as arrogant, too young, and too bold. He switched parties early in his political career, from conservative to liberal, earning both admiration and enemies. He spoke too freely, challenged traditions, and often stood alone. As he entered Parliament in 1900, many doubted his staying power. Some even dismissed him as a showman who chased danger just to write stories. But Winston wasn't just chasing danger. He was chasing destiny. And though the world was changing rapidly, with rising powers, shifting alliances, and a fragile peace, it would take years before Churchill would face the moment history had in store for him. For now, his greatest challenge was still far ahead, and it would shake not just his career, but the world itself. By the early 1900s, Winston Churchill had entered the British Parliament with fire in his heart and fierce opinions in his speeches. At just 26 years old, he spoke like a man far older, unafraid to criticize tradition, unafraid to confront the mighty. He was brilliant, yes, but also brash. And not everyone liked that. He joined the Liberal Party, breaking ranks with the Conservatives, the party of his father. It was a bold move, many called it betrayal. But for Churchill, truth was more important than loyalty to labels. He believed the people needed social reform, not just imperial pride. As a politician, he began pushing for workers' rights, pensions, and education reforms. His voice thundered in Parliament, but often, he found himself alone, his ideas too progressive for some, too arrogant for others. Still, he pressed on. He quickly rose through the ranks, becoming president of the Board of Trade, then Home Secretary, and eventually First Lord of the Admiralty, in charge of the Royal Navy. Churchill was relentless, pouring his energy into preparing Britain for what he feared was coming, war in Europe. Long before many others, Churchill saw the danger in the rise of Germany's military power and the fragile state of European alliances. While others celebrated peace, he sounded alarms. He warned that the world was drifting toward catastrophe. But the more he warned, the more he was mocked. They called him dramatic. They said he was stuck in the past, obsessed with war stories and old glories. Even his own colleagues began to push him aside. Then came the First World War, and suddenly, Churchill's fears were realized. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he moved quickly, mobilizing the British fleet. His leadership was energetic, even visionary. But then came a mistake that nearly destroyed him: Gallipoli. In 1915, Churchill proposed a bold naval assault to break the deadlock in the trenches by striking through the Dardanelles and taking control of Constantinople. The plan was risky, but Churchill believed it could change the war. The operation turned into a disaster. Poor planning, fierce resistance, and logistical nightmares led to a bloody stalemate. Thousands of Allied soldiers died. Churchill was blamed. He was forced to resign. At 41, he had reached the heights of power, and then fell in disgrace. But this is where Churchill's true character began to shine. Instead of retreating into comfort or politics, he did the unthinkable: he returned to the battlefield. Churchill enlisted as an officer on the Western Front. He didn't have to. No one expected it. But he did it to prove something, to himself and to the nation. In the muddy trenches of France, under enemy fire, he rebuilt his spirit. He shared tea and stories with the men. He faced danger with the same courage he once showed as a young soldier in South Africa. There, in the mud and silence of war, Churchill rediscovered humility. He returned to politics years later, not with arrogance, but with a renewed sense of purpose. But fate had more in store. By the 1930s, Churchill once again found himself in the political wilderness. His warnings about the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany were dismissed. He was seen as outdated, a relic of the past, shouting about dangers no one wanted to see. But Churchill refused to stay silent. Speech after speech, he warned Parliament: Germany is rearming. The storm is coming. Britain must prepare. They didn't listen. And so, Winston Churchill watched, heart heavy, as Europe drifted toward its darkest hour. But that hour was coming, and when it arrived, it would call for a voice powerful enough to rally a nation. And Churchill would be ready. It was 1939. The world stood on the edge of chaos. Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, had invaded Poland. Britain and France had declared war. But many still hoped it would be a limited conflict, a war that might fade if ignored. Churchill knew better. After years in political exile, he was finally called back. The storm he had predicted for so long had arrived, and Britain needed a leader who could face it without fear. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, once the face of appeasement, appointed Churchill as First Lord of the Admiralty again. In one symbolic moment, the Royal Navy signaled its ships: Winston is back. Churchill wasted no time. He worked day and night, preparing Britain's naval defenses and warning about the growing threat. He pushed the government to act faster, harder. Then, in May 1940, everything changed. Hitler's blitzkrieg swept across Europe. Denmark and Norway fell. The Netherlands was invaded. Belgium collapsed. And now, France, Britain's strongest ally, was crumbling. It was a moment of national panic. Neville Chamberlain's leadership was questioned. The British people lost faith. Parliament murmured with frustration and fear. Then came the historic day, May 10, 1940. Chamberlain stepped down, and the king called upon one man, one voice who had never surrendered to doubt, never bowed to fear. Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. It was perhaps the most crucial moment in modern British history. The country was alone. America was not yet in the war. The German war machine seemed unstoppable. Even Churchill's closest colleagues questioned whether Britain could survive. And now, at the age of 65, a man once labeled reckless, arrogant, and outdated stood to lead. His first speech as Prime Minister shook the world. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." He did not promise comfort. He did not offer illusions. Instead, he gave Britain the truth, and something else even more powerful, hope. His words cut through despair like lightning through storm clouds. And that was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Hitler's army cornered the British Expeditionary Force at the beaches of Dunkirk. Over 300,000 troops faced annihilation. It was a disaster waiting to happen. But Churchill acted swiftly. He ordered the launch of Operation Dynamo, a desperate evacuation using warships, merchant vessels, and even fishing boats. Ordinary civilians sailed across the English Channel under gunfire to rescue trapped soldiers. Against all odds, more than 330,000 men were saved. Churchill stood before Parliament and delivered another immortal line. "We shall go on to the end, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall never surrender." These were not just words. They were weapons of spirit. And they mattered. Because Britain was next. France fell in June 1940. Hitler turned his gaze to the island nation, and invasion seemed certain. The Battle of Britain began. In the skies above England, the Royal Air Force, outnumbered and exhausted, fought wave after wave of German bombers. And below, the people listened for sirens and prayed in the dark of the London Blitz. Night after night, bombs rained down. Cities burned. Children hid underground. Families mourned. But Churchill never wavered. He visited bombed cities, standing with the people in the rubble. He spoke on the radio, his deep voice a lifeline for millions. And he praised the heroes who fought above. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The world watched in awe. Britain did not fall. Because Churchill, with his stubborn will and stirring words, had turned fear into defiance. He had become not just a leader, but the living symbol of British courage. And yet, as bombs still fell and Hitler's shadow loomed, the fight was far from over. Would this old lion of a man have the strength to hold the line until help arrived from across the sea? The darkest hour had not yet passed. Britain stood alone. All of Europe, it seemed, had fallen to Hitler's iron grip. Paris had surrendered. Poland, Norway, Belgium, all gone. The swastika flew where liberty once did. Only the island of Britain remained defiant. Only Churchill stood at the edge of the storm. But this was no ordinary storm. Night after night, German bombers blackened the skies. The London Blitz became a brutal rhythm, sirens, fire, rubble, mourning. More than 40,000 civilians were killed. Entire neighborhoods vanished in smoke. And still, Churchill would not bend. He walked through the bombed ruins, hat slightly tilted, cigar clenched in his teeth. Children ran to him. Workers cheered. Tears filled the eyes of grieving mothers, because they knew this man, more than anyone, felt their pain, shared their burden. Yet deep down, he bore a silent fear. What if Britain truly was alone forever? What if America never came? What if the spirit he had ignited could not withstand the fire to come? He was offered a way out. In 1940, the Italian ambassador hinted that peace with Hitler might be negotiated if Britain would just surrender its pride. Churchill's cabinet was split. Some believed negotiation was the only path to survival. Churchill stood alone. He looked around the table and, with thunder in his voice, made his choice clear. If this Long Island story of ours is to end, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. It was not bravado. It was resolve. The kind born not from fearlessness, but from deeper conviction. To give in to tyranny would mean the death of everything he held sacred: freedom, democracy, the soul of his people. So, he chose defiance. And Britain followed. But the war dragged on. In 1941, Germany broke its pact with Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union. A new front opened, stretching the Nazi war machine thin. It gave Britain a sliver of hope, but the price was enormous suffering in the East. And then, a single day changed everything. December 7, 1941. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. America entered the war. Churchill knew the tide was about to turn. He journeyed across the Atlantic, addressing the U.S. Congress with these words. What kind of people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget? The chamber erupted in applause. Britain was no longer alone. But Churchill's trials were far from over. He had to make terrible decisions. To protect secret Allied intelligence, he once allowed a town to be bombed, choosing silence over saving lives, to preserve the greater good. He watched as British soldiers died by the thousands in North Africa and Italy. He agonized over bombings that killed civilians in Germany, always balancing strategy with conscience. And in the shadows of every victory was the cost of every sacrifice. His speeches remained unshakable, but his heart grew heavy. He wrote in his journal late one night, "To each, the choice, to live as a sheep or to fight as a lion. I have chosen. And I shall not turn back." Through all of it, Churchill never stopped speaking to his people. His voice was the pulse of the nation. He reminded them of their shared pain, their shared purpose. He made them feel not only that they could win, but that they must win, for the sake of all free peoples. And that was his greatest power. Not just to command armies, but to lead hearts and minds in the face of darkness. Because in the end, it wasn't tanks or planes that kept Britain alive. It was the unbreakable spirit of a people who refused to kneel. And one man, who reminded them, "We shall never surrender." But as Allied victories mounted and the enemy retreated, a new kind of challenge emerged. Could Churchill lead in peace as powerfully as he had led in war? The final battles were near. But the war within was not yet over. By 1944, the tide of war had decisively turned. What once seemed impossible was now within reach. British, American, and Canadian troops prepared for the greatest amphibious assault in history, D-Day, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. As the Allied forces gathered on the southern coast of England, Churchill walked among them. Soldiers paused and saluted him, not just as a prime minister, but as a symbol of their purpose. He wanted to go with them. Churchill, ever the warrior at heart, asked to join the first wave of the Normandy landings. His generals were horrified. King George VI even declared that if Churchill went, he would go too. In the end, Churchill was persuaded to stay behind. But his spirit landed with them. June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy echoed with gunfire, courage, and sacrifice. By day's end, Allied forces had secured a foothold in Europe. It was the beginning of the end for Hitler's regime. In the months that followed, Churchill's leadership remained steady. His voice, though aging, still rang with purpose. He reminded Britain of what they were fighting for, not revenge, but liberation. And when, at last, Berlin fell in May 1945, and Hitler was dead by his own hand, Churchill stood before his people and declared victory in Europe Day. "This is your victory," he told them. "And in all our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this." Crowds flooded the streets of London. Tears, laughter, and songs filled the air. Union Jacks waved like flames of freedom. Churchill stood on the balcony of the Ministry of Health, looking out at the sea of faces. He raised his hand in his famous V for Victory sign, and the crowd roared. The war in Europe was over. He had led his nation through its darkest hours. He had refused surrender, rallied the world, and helped defeat the greatest evil of the century. But not all victories are followed by celebration. In July 1945, barely 2 months after the war ended in Europe, Britain held a general election. Churchill, believing his wartime leadership would carry into peace, felt confident. He was wrong. The British people, weary of war and longing for change, voted for the Labour Party in a landslide. Churchill, the man who had become a national hero, was voted out of office. It was a stunning blow. One of the greatest leaders in modern history was quietly removed just as peace dawned. But Churchill accepted the result with grace. He later said, "At least I was able to give the lion's roar." He retired to his countryside estate, Chartwell, and began to write. His pen, like his voice, carried power. Over the next years, he published a 6-volume history of World War II, helping generations understand the stakes, the strategies, and the suffering. In 1951, the people brought him back. At 77, Churchill once again became Prime Minister. But time had taken its toll. His health declined, and in 1955, he retired for good. Still, his influence never faded. In 1953, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, not for fiction, but for his mastery of historical and biographical description and for brilliant oratory in defending exalted human values. His words had moved nations. His will had helped save a continent. Even after stepping down, Churchill remained a global symbol of courage and resilience. He lived to see a Europe rebuilding. A world learning, slowly, the lessons of war. And a Britain that, while changed, still stood free. Churchill's greatest achievement was not just victory on the battlefield, it was the inspiration he gave his people to fight on, when all seemed lost. Because in every flame-lit night of the Blitz, in every whispered prayer of a soldier, and in every radio broadcast heard in fear and hope, there echoed the voice of one man. We shall never surrender. But what legacy did Churchill truly leave behind? The final chapter awaits. Winston Churchill passed away on January 24, 1965, exactly 70 years to the day after the death of his father. He was 90 years old. The news reverberated around the globe. In London, more than 300,000 people lined up to pay their respects as he lay in state in Westminster Hall. His funeral was attended by leaders from over 100 countries, the largest gathering of world statesmen in history at that time. Churchill was not just mourned, he was honored. He was given a state funeral, a rare privilege normally reserved for royalty. As his coffin was carried through the streets of London, the silence was deep and profound. Even the cranes on the River Thames bowed their steel necks in salute. But Churchill's true legacy cannot be measured in ceremonies. It lives on in the spirit of defiance and dignity he gave his people. It lives in every voice that dares to speak truth in the face of tyranny. In every nation that refuses to bow to oppression. In every person who finds courage when the night is darkest. Churchill was far from perfect. He was complex, stubborn, and controversial in many of his decisions. His views, especially on empire and race, have drawn rightful criticism in modern times. But in Britain's most desperate hour, when the very idea of freedom was under siege, it was Churchill who stood firm. And he did more than lead. He gave people hope. He made them believe that they mattered. That they had a role in history. That together, they could withstand anything. His speeches were not just political, they were moral beacons, guiding people through fear and doubt. Success is not final, failure is not fatal, it is the courage to continue that counts. This idea, of courage in continuation, is perhaps Churchill's greatest gift. He reminded us that leadership is not about being fearless, it is about moving forward despite fear. He reminded us that history is shaped not only by great victories, but by great determination. And he reminded the world that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one voice, resolute and unwavering, can rally a nation and change the course of history. His story is not just a chapter in Britain's past. It's a lesson for every generation. When the world trembles, when freedom is under threat, when hope seems distant, we remember the man who lit a candle in the storm and refused to let it die. But how can you carry Churchill's legacy forward? Let's bring it all together in our closing thoughts. Dear learners, you've just walked through the stormy chapters of one of history's most powerful lives. Winston Churchill was not born to be perfect, he was born to persist. Through failure and loss, doubt and danger, he found his strength not in being invincible, but in being unshakable. And that is his lasting message to you. Whether you're facing personal hardship, struggling with your studies, or simply trying to grow one step at a time, you can keep going. You can stand firm, even when everything else feels uncertain. Because courage is not about never falling. It's about never surrendering. Let Churchill's words echo in your heart the next time life challenges you. Let his example remind you that your voice matters, especially when you use it for good. And as you improve your English through these stories, remember this. You're not just learning a language. You're connecting with the souls of history. You're stepping into the lives of people who dared to shape the world. If this story moved you, share Churchill's courage with someone else. Let others feel the strength in his words. Carry his torch forward, bright, bold, and unwavering. And don't forget, if this story helped you grow, inspired you, or taught you something new, like, comment, and subscribe to keep this journey going. There are more heroes to meet, more lessons to learn, and more stories that will touch your heart and strengthen your spirit. Until next time. Keep learning, keep growing, and never give in. Goodbye for now.